San Diego at night glowed with salt air and chandelier light as waves whispered against the glass walls of an oceanfront restaurant built for the rich and untouchable. Inside, servers moved like clockwork, silverware rang softly, and wealth sat in confidence at every table. Ethan Cole stood at the entrance with his 7-year-old son Oliver, hesitating, as if crossing an invisible border between grief and performance. It was the first dinner out since the night his wife died. Oliver clutched his father's hand, his small fingers damp with fear as the noise of the room pressed in on him. "Daddy," he whispered, his voice barely rising above the music, "what if you disappear like Mommy?" The words landed heavier than any sound in the room, and Ethan felt the familiar ache spread through his chest. He knelt for a moment, forcing a smile he did not feel, and guided his son forward past the waiting line of tables. Near the service corridor, where the glow of luxury faded into working shadows, a woman in a faded diner uniform sat with a little girl who swung her legs beneath the chair. The woman was Rachel, and exhaustion etched her face even as she smoothed her daughter's hair with gentle care. Sophie waited for her mother to finish a late shift, drawing shapes on a napkin and humming softly to herself, unaware of the eyes that had found her smile. Sophie glanced up and met Oliver's eyes across the crowded room, and without hesitation, she smiled at him as if greeting a friend she had always known. It was a small, simple smile, but it pierced the quiet wall around the boy. Oliver froze, then slowly, his lips lifted in the first real smile he had shown in months. He tugged at Ethan's jacket, urgency trembling in his hands, as he leaned close to whisper his next words to him. "Daddy, the girl's mom looks sad even when she smiles." The sentence struck Ethan with surprising force because it was true, and because Oliver had noticed what wealth and strategy had taught him to ignore. Before Ethan could answer, a sharply dressed restaurant manager approached Rachel's table with a tight, polite expression and informed her that she and her daughter needed to move because a very important guest was arriving. The room watched as Rachel gathered her bag with humiliation. Sophie looked confused, then frightened, clinging to her mother's leg as whispers rippled through the nearby tables. Rachel forced a nod, trying to stay composed for her child, and began to rise. In that moment, something in Ethan broke open. The billionaire who ruled boardrooms with silence and fear stood up so suddenly that his chair scraped loudly across the floor, turning every head in the restaurant toward him, and toward the injustice he could no longer ignore inside himself. A server hurried toward Ethan in alarm, whispering that his reserved VIP table was ready, but Ethan did not answer. He turned instead to Rachel and said simply that she and her daughter were not moving anywhere tonight. Then he did the unthinkable. He canceled his private table and pulled an empty chair from the next aisle, dragging it across polished stone until it rested beside Sophie. He lowered himself into it without asking permission from anyone in the room. The restaurant fell into a stunned silence. A billionaire had just chosen the shadowed edge over the spotlight. Rachel stared at him as if she were unsure whether to run or cry, while Sophie blinked in awe and broke into a delighted giggle. Oliver let out a shaky laugh of his own and slid closer to the small girl as if an invisible wall had been gently removed. Wealth and struggle now shared one narrow table by the service corridor. Rachel finally found her voice and tried to protest, her cheeks burning with the certainty that this kindness would cost her later, but Ethan only met her gaze with quiet resolve. Sophie laughed and scooted her chair closer to Oliver, as if the decision were already final. Around them, phones lifted discreetly and murmurs coiled through the affluent crowd, disbelief mixing with judgment. Some saw charity, some saw scandal, but none yet saw the storm that had set in motion. At the end of the corridor, the ocean surged against glass, as if echoing the tension inside the room. Ethan felt Oliver lean against his side, small and trusting, and for the first time since his wife died, he did not pull away from the weight of another life near his own. Rachel sat frozen between fear and gratitude, sensing that nothing about this night would remain small or simple for long. Tonight San Diego slept unaware of the collapse. The tension at the narrow table slowly softened, as Sophie leaned forward with fearless curiosity and asked Oliver what his favorite cartoon was. He hesitated, as if surprised that someone wanted to know, then answered in a quiet voice that he liked the one with the lonely robot searching for its creator. Sophie clapped her hands and said the robot was brave because it kept walking even when it was scared. Oliver considered that seriously, then nodded. Ethan watched the exchange with stunned stillness, as if witnessing a language his son had forgotten how to speak for the first time. Rachel remained tense, shoulders tight, as though she expected the floor manager to return at any moment and correct this strange mercy. Her eyes kept scanning the room while she listened to the children talk, measuring risk even inside this fragile comfort. Sophie told Oliver that her mommy sang in the shower so no one could hear her cry, and then she smiled as if it were the funniest secret in the world. Mommy cries in the shower so I sing loud for her, she said, proud of her solution. Ethan felt the words cut through him with sudden force. Oliver lowered his eyes and admitted in a small voice that he thought he was the only lonely kid in the world. Sophie shook her head with determined seriousness and told him that lonely kids always found each other eventually because they were looking harder than everyone else. The simple certainty in her tone loosened something in his chest, and he breathed a little deeper. Between them, a fragile bridge formed out of shared absence and unexpected understanding. Ethan felt a strange ache of gratitude toward a child he had met only minutes ago that he did not fully understand. Across the table, Rachel finally allowed herself to look at Ethan directly, not as a billionaire but as a man sitting beside her child with quiet attentiveness. Their eyes met for the first time without fear or calculation, and the world seemed to momentarily narrow around that single exchange. There was no flirtation, yet only a dull ache of recognition that both tried to ignore. Rachel looked away first, unsettled by how easily his gaze pierced the armor she wore every day. Ethan noticed the tremor in her hands as she lifted her water glass and took a careful sip. The waiter returned cautiously with menus as if approaching an unstable truce, and the room resumed a low murmur of conversation that never fully hid the attention fixed on their table. Oliver and Sophie compared their school lunches in hushed voices, laughing over crushed crackers and bent straws as if these small confessions were treasures. Rachel listened with half an ear while calculating whether she could afford even the simplest item should the offer of shared dinner become real. Ethan ordered for himself without looking at any prices, then quietly asked Rachel what she would choose if money were not. Rachel hesitated, startled by the sincerity of the question more than its implication. She answered that she would choose whatever her daughter loved the most tonight because choice itself felt like a luxury she could rarely afford. Sophie immediately declared she wanted the same thing as Oliver, so they could be twins for one meal, and Oliver laughed with a bright sound that turned heads nearby. Ethan felt his throat tighten at the simple agreement between children, a treaty formed without power or fear. Rachel saw something soften in his face, and wondered what grief had carved such lines there. Around them, the clatter of plates and the hush of judgment blended into a distant tide, as Oliver and Sophie continued to talk about imaginary pets and silly teachers. For the first time since his wife died, Ethan noticed that the weight in his chest shifted, rather than settled, as if a window had cracked open at the edge of a sealed room. Rachel felt something similar and hated herself for feeling it, because hope to her had always been an expensive mistake. She watched Ethan carefully, searching for the arrogance she had learned to expect from men with power. Sophie leaned closer to Oliver and whispered that her mommy worked very hard and sometimes forgot to eat because she was always worrying about tomorrow. Oliver took that in with the seriousness of someone who understood worry far too well, and promised that he would remind her to eat dessert tonight because dessert meant the day had ended safely. Sophie laughed and agreed as if this were an important responsibility. Rachel heard the exchange and felt her eyes sting, quickly blinking it away before her daughter could notice. Ethan saw the gesture and understood without explanation that this woman carried. The food arrived with careful precision, yet no one at the table rushed to touch it. Oliver waited until Sophie picked up her fork, then mirrored her motion with solemn devotion. Rachel laughed softly at the small ritual, and the sound startled even herself. Ethan felt the vibration of it travel straight through him, warming something he had kept numb for too long. The children began to eat together with easy enthusiasm, comparing bites and inventing rules about who was allowed to taste what. Around them, the room gradually resumed its rhythm, but the attention never fully drifted away from. Rachel finally ate a small bite, as Sophie urged her to try it, and the simple act felt strangely intimate because it required her to trust that nothing would be demanded in return. Ethan ate as well, though he barely tasted the food, consumed instead by the image of his son laughing freely beside a child who owed him nothing. The thought tightened his chest with equal parts fear and longing. He wondered how fragile this moment was, and whether wealth or reputation would soon storm back in and claim it. Rachel wondered the same and prepared herself quietly for. In the brief space between bites and glances, something unspoken took root at that table, fragile but undeniable. Two children who had recognized each other in loneliness now shared the language of safety without knowing its name. Two adults who had learned to survive through distance found themselves unprepared for how close the moment felt. Ethan caught Rachel watching Oliver, as if memorizing the way he smiled, and Rachel caught Ethan watching Sophie, as if measuring what he had never been taught to give. Neither spoke of what they felt, yet both sensed that this recognition could not remain harmless. The shift in the room became visible as soon as the food settled on the table, and the initial shock of Ethan's decision wore off because judgment always returned once surprise faded. From the far end of the restaurant, quiet murmurs sharpened into pointed whispers that slid through the air like cold blades. Rachel felt it before she heard it, the familiar tightening in her chest that came whenever eyes lingered too long on her worn shoes or the faded seam of her uniform. A woman in an elegant black dress leaned toward her companion and said just loud enough to carry that some women knew exactly how to climb when opportunity finally looked their way. Another voice followed, softer but crueler, saying that single moms always had a plan and rich men were easy targets if they believed they were playing savior. Rachel kept her eyes on Sophie and pretended not to hear because pretending had been her shield for years. Ethan heard every word. He recognized the sound of people constructing a story that allowed them to feel superior. Oliver did not understand the words but sensed the shift in the air and leaned closer to Sophie with confusion in his eyes. Sophie smiled at him as if nothing in the world had changed, still unaware of how quickly adults learn to weaponize assumptions. Rachel lifted her water glass again, but this time, the tremor in her hand was impossible to hide. She had lived inside assumptions since the day her husband died. Before that, she had been Rachel Miller, the college student, the woman who worked nights and studied days with the reckless belief that effort would one day make life gentler. Then, the accident happened. Her husband Daniel had been a site supervisor on a commercial construction project for a medical research firm contracted under a larger corporate umbrella. A collapsed scaffold, a faulty bolt, a fall that turned one ordinary afternoon into a lifetime fracture. The company issued statements of regret and sympathy before the ambulance had even cleared the street. They promised an investigation that never reached the evening news. By the time Daniel was buried, responsibility had already blurred into the folds of legal language. Rachel had been offered a settlement that came with quiet strings. Sign the papers, promise no public accusations, swallow what could not be proven. She had refused at first. The letters had come next, cool and precise, explaining how difficult a legal fight could be for a grieving woman with a newborn daughter and no financial safety. Then the phone calls started, anonymous voices that never threatened her directly, but spoke about how fragile custody arrangements could become when resources ran thin. One voice had casually mentioned the name of her pediatrician and the hours Sophie attended preschool. That was the night Rachel signed. From that point forward, the world decided who she was allowed to be. Rachel, the lawsuit that never happened. Rachel, the widow with a silence clause. Rachel, the single mom who learned that justice owned a price tag she could never touch. Each job since then had been a reminder that survival moved faster than dignity when a child needed food and a roof. The restaurant tonight felt like an illusion she had never been meant to step into, and every whisper confirmed that truth. Ethan saw Rachel's shoulders draw inward as the voices continued. A man, 2 tables over, laughed softly and said that some women simply knew when to deploy a smile. Another guest commented that single mothers always followed money the way heat followed flame. Ethan pushed his chair back just a fraction closer to Rachel, as if presence could form a barrier. Rachel noticed and stiffened, fearing that association itself would deepen the damage. Sophie looked up and asked in a clear voice why the people nearby sounded angry. Rachel answered too quickly that they were just tired. Oliver studied the adults around them and felt something cold slide into his stomach that he did not yet have words for. He had seen this look on the faces of people who believed power gave them permission. The waiter hesitated near their table longer than necessary, his gaze flicking between Rachel's clothes and Ethan's presence. The manager returned under the pretense of checking service quality, his smile tight, with thinly veiled contempt. Rachel felt the old humiliation stir, the reflex to apologize for existing in a space that had not been built with her in mind. She had learned to apologize even when she had done nothing wrong. Ethan saw that too. He saw the instinctive way she shrank, as though expecting to be corrected. It made something harden in him that no boardroom battle ever had. Rachel did not know who he truly was beyond the way others reacted to him, but she recognized power by the way it bent behavior around itself. She had spent years living without it. She leaned forward slightly and whispered to Ethan that she did not want any trouble and that she and Sophie would leave if asked. The words tasted bitter even as she spoke them. Ethan met her eyes and said quietly that no one at this table was leaving because someone else decided they did not belong. His voice carried just enough weight to still the space around them without raising it. Rachel felt the unfamiliar sensation of someone drawing a line for her without demanding payment for it. Across the room the judgment did not stop, but it shifted into something more cautious, more curious. Assumptions adapted as they always did. Some now believed Rachel must have already climbed higher than they imagined. Others decided she was playing a longer game. Only a few considered the possibility that nothing about her was calculated. Rachel focused on Sophie, who was laughing with Oliver over a shared bite of dessert, and explaining that sprinkles were little stars you were allowed to eat. Rachel watched her daughter, and felt the quiet ache of knowing how much Sophie had already learned to carry without being asked. She had learned that people judged before they listened. She had learned that hunger came in more than one form. She had learned that her mother's worry was heavier than any backpack she would ever wear. Ethan observed Rachel in profile, the strength it took to sit still under the weight of so many unseen verdicts. He saw the guarded dignity that never asked for rescue, only room to breathe. It stirred something unfamiliar in him, a respect that did not admire from a distance but wanted to stand beside. Around them the restaurant moved on in its elegant rhythm, but the current beneath had shifted. The single mom everyone judged remained seated in quiet defiance, her child safe beside a boy who had found his first unguarded smile in her presence, and the man who had chosen their table over his own private kingdom sat as if the simple act of staying had become a statement. The noise of the restaurant softened into a distant hum, as Oliver's attention drifted inward, the laughter between him and Sophie fading into a quieter space, where memories pressed closer than voices. He sat very still for a long moment, his fork resting untouched beside his plate, as if he were measuring the courage it took to speak. Ethan noticed the change first, the way his son's shoulders tightened, and his eyes drifted toward the dark ocean beyond the glass. Sophie followed his gaze and waited without interrupting, a patience that surprised even her mother. Oliver finally spoke in a voice so small it barely traveled across the table. He said that his mother had died in a room that smelled like cold air and beeping machines, and that he had watched the doctors run when the room suddenly filled with shouting. He said that everyone told him to be brave, and that brave meant not crying too loud. He said that after that day he stopped talking about her because every time he tried, people looked uncomfortable and changed the subject. He said he was afraid that if he talked about her too much she would disappear faster. The words fell unevenly, as if he were pulling them from a place that hurt to touch. Ethan felt his chest hollow as he listened and realized with crushing clarity how much his son had learned to carry alone beside him. Rachel did not move. She had heard children speak of loss before, but never with such contained precision. Sophie leaned closer to Oliver and studied his face with careful seriousness. Then she did the simplest and bravest thing she knew how to do. She told him in a steady voice that if his mommy had died on a table, then she probably fell asleep holding thoughts of him, because mothers always carried their children, even when they were scared. She said that people did not really leave when they died, and that God just borrowed them longer than we wanted. The sentence sounded too large for a 6-year-old mouth, and yet it rang with clarity. Oliver blinked hard and felt his throat tighten. For the first time since his mother had died, the idea of her absence shifted from something sharp to something strange and distant, like an ache that could breathe. He asked Sophie if her daddy had left too. Sophie nodded and said that her daddy was buried under dirt and flowers, and that she talked to him anyway because it made her feel less small. She said that sometimes she forgot the words, but that she just talked anyway, and that was enough. Oliver listened as if every word were an instruction he had been waiting for. Ethan watched the exchange with a pain and wonder too big to hide. He had believed shelter meant silence, and he saw now that silence had been its own kind of storm. Rachel felt her breath catch as Sophie spoke, never having realized how clearly her daughter understood the language of absence. The table seemed to tilt inward, as if drawing closer around the children. Oliver took a breath and said that he had seen his mother on the operating table, with her eyes closed, and that he had been afraid she was pretending. He said that afterward he kept expecting her to walk in through doors, and then felt foolish when she did not. He said that sometimes he dreamed she stood at the foot of his bed and tried to wake him, but her mouth did not make any sound. Sophie reached across the table and took his hand without hesitation. Her fingers were warm and certain. She told him that if his mommy could not speak in dreams, then maybe she spoke in feelings, and that maybe he heard her every time he felt brave, even when he was scared. Oliver felt a tear slide free before he could stop it and did not hide it. Ethan saw the tear and did not rush to wipe it away. He let his son be seen for once. Rachel felt something open painfully inside her as she witnessed the tenderness between two children who had never met until this night. She realized how easily children built meaning where adults built walls. Oliver pressed his lips together and whispered that he had stopped talking about his mommy because he did not want to make his daddy sad. Ethan felt the truth of that land with quiet devastation. He leaned forward and told Oliver that talking about her did not make him sad in the way his son feared. He said that what made him sad was thinking she was being forgotten. His voice trembled as he spoke, and Oliver watched him with surprise as if seeing his father cry for the first time. The room around them continued to move, but the table had become its own small world where truth no longer needed permission. Sophie nodded, and said that forgetting was the only thing that really made people disappear, and that as long as Oliver remembered his mommy she would never be gone. Oliver swallowed and nodded back with solemn understanding. The fear in his chest eased just enough to let warmth find space beside it. Rachel watched Ethan struggle to hold his composure, and felt something like recognition stir. She had hidden her own grief from Sophie for years, believing that her tears would only burden the child. Tonight she saw how grief unspoken could weigh heavier than grief shared. The children returned to their food slowly, as if stepping back from a sacred place. Oliver ate with a quieter focus, and Sophie hummed softly as she chewed, the sound steady and comforting. Ethan remained still for several breaths, letting the tremor in his hand settle before he reached for his own glass. He realized with clarity that this was the first honest conversation about his wife his son had ever been allowed to finish. Rachel felt the weight of the night deepen into something that would not simply fade with the last bite of dessert. The ocean beyond the glass surged and settled in its ancient rhythm, as if keeping time with the grief at the table. In that narrow space beside the service corridor, a boy who had stopped speaking about his mother found his voice again, not through strategy or protection, but through the kindness of a child who had learned that loss did not have to be silent. The waiter returned with the folded check in his hand, eyes sliding past Ethan, as if he were not seated there at all, and rested the small leather holder in front of Rachel instead. His voice was polite, but carried an edge that cut through the low music. "Can you take care of this now, ma'am?" Rachel stared at the bill as if it were written in another language. The numbers swam, and her first instinct was to apologize. Her second instinct was to protect Sophie from seeing how suddenly fear could change a heartbeat. She felt it racing wildly. Sophie leaned in with innocent concern, and asked if everything was okay, and the question broke what little balance Rachel had left. Around them, the whispers sharpened, no longer hidden behind wine glasses and linen. Someone laughed that the show had reached its natural conclusion. Another voice said that this was always how it ended for girls who tried above their station. Rachel felt heat climb her face, as years of practiced endurance faltered. She slid the bill back toward the waiter with shaking fingers and said she needed a minute, though she knew a minute would change nothing at all. Oliver sensed the shift and drew closer to Sophie, his shoulders rising defensively as he looked at Ethan with a question he did not voice. Ethan followed Oliver's gaze to the check, and then to the waiter, and the calm he had worn since sitting down broke with visible finality. He asked the waiter who had decided that the bill belonged to the woman at the table rather than to him. The waiter hesitated, and said it was simply procedure. Ethan replied that procedure did not erase basic decency. The manager appeared again as if summoned by tension alone. The manager smiled with brittle courtesy, and said they did not mean any offense, but that misunderstandings could be avoided if guests respected their assigned areas. Rachel stiffened at the phrase assigned areas, hearing its older meaning beneath the polished words. Sophie looked up and asked why her mommy was in the wrong place if she had not done anything wrong. The question cut deeper than accusation. The manager faltered and redirected his eyes toward Ethan with a look that asked silently for rescue from the situation he had created. Ethan did not offer it. He told the manager that if anyone was out of place, it was anyone who believed humiliation was an acceptable tool. A woman at a nearby table stood and said loudly that she wanted no part in a spectacle, and that the restaurant should handle its charity case elsewhere. A man added that this was exactly how scandals began, and that it reflected poorly on serious investors. The judgment gained momentum as if it had been waiting for permission. Rachel felt the room tilt and reached instinctively for Sophie, preparing herself to leave before the scene swallowed what was left of her dignity. Oliver rose in his seat and said in a trembling voice that they were his friends and that his daddy had chosen their table. His words drew scattered laughter from the crowd. The sound struck Ethan like sand in the eyes. He stood fully, then slow and unmistakable, and the room felt its center of gravity shift. He said with quiet force that there would be no handling of Rachel elsewhere, and no explanations owed to anyone seated beyond their table. He said that anyone who believed compassion was a spectacle had already emptied the word of its meaning. The manager tried once more to appeal to order, and was cut off by Ethan saying that order built on embarrassment was not order at all. Silence pressed down as phones subtly lifted again. The waiter attempted to place the bill back on the table, and Ethan took it from his hand with a look that allowed no further negotiation. He set it down in front of himself, and asked that the restaurant continue to serve their table without interruption. Rachel felt the blood rush in her ears, as heat and cold collided inside her. Part of her wanted to vanish. Another part wanted to believe that she was allowed to remain without apology. Sophie squeezed her hand and said it was okay because Oliver was brave and his daddy was brave too. Rachel swallowed hard and stayed seated. A man near the bar muttered that the rich liked to play with broken things and toss them aside when they were bored. The comment hung thick with cruelty. Rachel looked at Ethan then with a warning in her eyes that he might yet regret standing so publicly beside her. Ethan met the look and answered without words that regret no longer frightened him. He could feel the currents shifting around his life, and knew that retreat would only delay the reckoning he had already invited. Across the table, Oliver watched his father with wide eyes as if seeing him for the first time as something other than distant. The manager retreated at last with rigid politeness, and service resumed under an uneasy truce that fooled no one. The whispers softened but did not disappear. They merely changed shape, now tinged with speculation rather than scorn. Rachel tried to eat but found her appetite had fled. She studied Sophie's face instead, grateful for the way the child remained untouched by the weapons used among adults. Oliver leaned towards Sophie and whispered that she was very brave and that his mommy had been brave too. Sophie nodded solemnly and declared that bravery meant staying when you were scared. The sentence settled between the adults like a small truth laid gently down. Ethan felt the weight of the night deepen into consequence. He understood that his choice had drawn a line that could not be erased by money or influence alone. The public nature of the moment had transformed it from kindness into declaration. Rachel sensed it as well and felt equal parts terror and relief. She had survived many quiet humiliations. This one was not quiet, and somehow, that made it harder and lighter at the same time. The ocean beyond the glass rolled dark and steady as if mirroring the certainty that something irreversible had crossed a threshold inside the room. The table remained still and shared. The dessert arrived at last untouched for a long moment, as if no one dared resume normal rhythm. Sophie finally dipped her spoon into the sweetness and smiled with approval, and Oliver followed with careful imitation. The simple return of ordinary motion released a breath the room had been holding. Rachel allowed herself one small bite, and felt the tremor within her settle just enough to continue breathing without strain. Ethan watched the children and knew that no rebuke from wealth would unmake the choice he had made. The humiliation that had been meant to drive Rachel away had instead rooted her in place beside him, and everyone who watched understood that the night had passed a point of no quiet return. The tension had barely begun to soften when Etienne's phone vibrated against the edge of the table with a sharp insistence that felt louder than sound, and the brief glance he took at the screen altered the air around him with immediate gravity. A breaking news alert spread across the display with ruthless efficiency, announcing that a video had surfaced online, accusing Cole Neurotech of concealing fatal failures in its newborn neural health trials. The clip had been edited with surgical cruelty cutting between distorted lab footage and selectively chosen commentary that painted Ethan as a man who sacrificed lives for profit. For a moment, the restaurant seemed to tilt as if the polished floor had lost its balance. Ethan read the words again and again, each line tightening the pressure behind his eyes until his breathing turned shallow and uneven. Across the room, several phones chimed in rapid succession as the alert reached other tables. The whispers reignited louder now, and edged with excitement rather than judgment. Ethan felt heat surge up his neck as the magnitude of what was unfolding collided with the humiliation still lingering in the air. Oliver sensed the shift instantly, and looked up with alarm, asking what was wrong, but Ethan could not bring himself to answer. His pulse pounded wildly as images of hospitals and boardrooms blurred together in his mind, the past and present colliding with violent speed. Grant Winder stood near the bar pretending to scroll through his own phone, the faint curve at the corner of his mouth hidden from all but the most attentive eyes. He had been waiting for this exact alignment of public spectacle and emotional vulnerability. Ethan tried to steady himself to apply the discipline he had mastered in crisis rooms, before fear and ambition reshaped him into something else. But panic does not respect history. The room pressed inward, every sound sharpening into distortion, and the ocean beyond the glass seemed to roar with sudden force. His vision narrowed as if the world were folding in on a single unbearable point. He took one step back from the table, and the next one faltered. Rachel saw the change before anyone else did. Years of watching exhaustion tip into danger had trained her eye to read the fragile boundary. She rose instinctively as Ethan staggered, his hand grasping at air that no longer held him. Oliver cried out as his father collapsed sideways, the chair toppling with a sharp impact that froze the entire room in stunned silence. For a split second no one moved. Then Rachel was already at Ethan's side, pressing her fingers to his neck, with practiced certainty counting in rapid silent measure as his pulse fluttered erratically beneath her touch. She instructed the nearest stunned server to call emergency services and asked for water and sugar, with a command that left no room for delay. Someone finally shouted that an ambulance was on the way. Oliver dropped to his knees beside his father, sobbing in frightened bursts as he begged Ethan to wake up. Sophie stood frozen with wide, terrified eyes, clutching her spoon as if it were an anchor. Rachel steadied her own breathing as she worked, speaking calm instructions to Oliver, even as the boy trembled with fear. She told him to hold his father's hand and talk to him because hearing was the last thing to leave. Ethan gasped weakly as cold water touched his lips, his body responding in uneven waves as the sugar began to take effect. The restaurant erupted into chaos as guests stood or backed away, some filming, others calling out useless questions. Grant remained still, watching from a distance with clinical interest, as if observing the final movement of a calculated equation. When Ethan's eyes finally fluttered open, unfocused and glassy, the relief that surged through Oliver was so intense that he nearly collapsed into sobs again. Rachel kept her hand steady at Ethan's pulse until his breathing slowed into something resembling rhythm. The approaching siren grew louder outside as the room slowly realized that survival had returned where loss had nearly claimed its place. Paramedics rushed in with controlled urgency and transferred Ethan to the stretcher as Oliver clung desperately to one side. Rachel lifted Sophie into her arms and followed without thinking, her night fractured into before and after. As the stretcher rolled past the bar, Grant at last stepped forward with a look of feigned concern and whispered to a nearby reporter that stress had finally caught up with Ethan at the worst possible moment. The headline was already writing itself. In the ambulance, Ethan drifted in and out of consciousness, the echo of Oliver's voice anchoring him as the medic monitored his vitals. Rachel sat opposite on the narrow bench, holding Sophie, who had gone quiet with shock. Rachel explained in urgent fragments what she believed had happened, that his collapse matched acute panic, compounded by sudden hypoglycemia, triggered by stress and exhaustion rather than any deeper condition. The medic listened seriously and nodded, confirming the pattern as they administered stabilizing treatment. Ethan surfaced more fully, then meeting Rachel's eyes with a dazed expression that carried both confusion and gratitude. He tried to speak, but Rachel pressed her finger gently to his lips and told him to save his strength. At the hospital, the pace accelerated into relentless procedural motion. Oliver was guided into a waiting area by a nurse, while tests were rushed through sterile corridors. Rachel remained near the entrance to the treatment bay under the watch of security, who did not yet know whether to treat her as concern or complication. Grant arrived not long after with members of the executive team, his concern polished and impeccably public. He spoke to reporters about the pressures Ethan faced and the difficult truths that were finally coming to light. Rachel heard fragments of his comments and felt a cold understanding settle into place. This collapse had not been an accident of fate, it had been invited. When Ethan was stabilized and transferred to recovery, the doctor confirmed that the episode had been precipitated by sudden severe stress, layered over chronic exhaustion. It was recoverable, it was survivable, it was weaponized. Oliver was brought to his father's bedside at last, and clung to his hand with trembling relief. Rachel stood at the doorway, holding Sophie, caught between the instinct to withdraw and the knowledge that withdrawal now carried its own dangers. Across the hall, Grant watched the quiet reunion and allowed himself a narrow, satisfied smile, already calculating the leverage the night had delivered into his hands. The room that had shattered at the restaurant now existed in fragments across screens and whispers throughout the city, and the collapse that had nearly taken Ethan from his son was only the first tremor of the storm still moving toward them all. Ethan awoke to the steady rhythm of machines, and the unfamiliar sense of being held inside something smaller than his world had been for years. The ceiling above him was pale and blurred at the edges, as if his vision were still returning from a great distance. For a moment he did not remember where he was or why his body felt hollow and heavy at the same time. Then Oliver's voice reached him, thin and trembling with relief, and the night returned in fractured pieces of light and sound. Ethan turned his head slowly, and saw his son standing beside the bed, gripping the rail with both hands, as if anchoring himself to the proof that his father was still there. The simple sight undid him more completely than any medical diagnosis ever had. Rachel stood near the doorway with Sophie asleep against her shoulder, her posture stiff with restraint, as if she were prepared to disappear the moment she was asked. Ethan met her eyes and understood that she had been the first to reach him when he fell. The knowledge warmed and shamed him in equal measure. The doctor spoke quietly about recovery and rest, and about the necessity of distance from immediate stressors, and Ethan heard the instructions as if they were coming from a room far away. When the door finally closed and they were left in the hush of white walls and pulsing monitors, Ethan asked Oliver if he was frightened. Oliver nodded with exhausted honesty and buried his face in the blanket near his father's hand. Ethan pressed his palm weakly against the back of the small head, and said he was sorry in a voice hoarse with things he had not said before. Rachel watched the exchange from the threshold and felt the old instinct to retreat tighten through her, yet something held her in place. Ethan looked toward her again and asked her to stay just a little while longer so Oliver would not be alone when he drifted back to sleep. Rachel hesitated only a breath before nodding. She eased Sophie onto the empty chair, and brushed the hair from her daughter's forehead, with a tenderness she wore so naturally, she rarely noticed it. The room settled into a softer quiet, as Oliver's breathing evened out beside the bed. With the crisis momentarily distant, the edges of the man beneath the title began to surface. Ethan spoke quietly, as if afraid the truth might retreat if spoken too loudly. He told Rachel that before the money, there had been hospitals and late-night coffee, and hands that shook from fatigue rather than control. He had studied medicine with singular devotion because he believed saving lives was the highest form of meaning a person could earn. He had met his wife during residency on a night neither of them should have stayed awake through. She had been stubborn and brilliant, and unafraid of his ambition. They married before either of them had learned how heavy lives could become when responsibility multiplied faster than joy. When she became pregnant, they promised each other they would not let the work swallow what they were building. But the research came and the breakthroughs came and the investors came, and one promise quietly lost to another. His wife supported his long absences with tired patience until the complications began, and fear replaced idealism in the corridors of their life. The night she died still returned to him with unbearable clarity. He had been across the country closing a funding round when the call came. By the time he returned, the bed was empty and the room already clean. He had not been in the room when his son took his first breath or when his wife took her last. After that, he told himself he would never again be absent from the only place that mattered. But grief does not always obey vows. He went back to the work with greater fury than before, and built a fortress of glass and code around his heart, because silence was easier than memory. The money came faster than the healing ever did. Rachel listened without interrupting, feeling the outline of her own loss emerge in his words, in a way that was too familiar to ignore. Ethan said he had believed that wealth would one day buy back time or at least ease the regret of having lost it. But sitting at that table tonight, he had seen his son smile for the first time in months, and understood that no acquisition had ever given him that gift. He said he had forgotten what it meant to be present before the money began to measure him instead of the other way around. Rachel told him quietly that presence was not something anyone ever truly learned how to master. It was only something they chose again and again, even when it hurt. Ethan closed his eyes and felt the truth of it settle into him with a weight that was not crushing. The sound of footsteps outside the door broke the stillness, and Rachel recognized the sharpened energy of corporate motion before the names were spoken. Members of the executive team were arriving, and with them the expectations that followed power, no matter where it tried to rest. Grant appeared briefly in the doorway with polished concern and said the board had convened an emergency session, and that the world was moving fast outside the walls that sheltered Ethan for now. Rachel felt the cold reach of the moment, even without understanding the full machinery behind it. Ethan saw the danger clearly. He asked Oliver to stay with Rachel and Sophie while he spoke to the doctors alone. Oliver resisted at first, but Rachel gently guided him into the chair beside Sophie, and told him his father would return. The promise tasted fragile. Outside in the corridor, Ethan listened as the outlines of accusation and opportunity aligned with perfect timing. Grant's voice spoke of responsibility and transparency, and the need for swift action. Ethan understood then that the collapse had not only exposed his mortality, but had offered others a chance to question his control. When he returned to the room, he found Rachel reading softly to Sophie, while Oliver listened from the floor with his back against the bed. The simple domestic scene struck him with an intensity he could barely endure. He realized that this was the life he had once imagined for himself before ambition remade his shape. Rachel looked up and met his gaze with a question in her eyes that he did not yet know how to answer. The past he had described was no longer only memory. It had begun to call him toward a different future. The hospital room fell quiet again after the door closed behind the last of the staff, leaving only the soft breathing of sleeping children and the distant rhythm of machines that measured life in steady pulses. Rachel remained seated beside Sophie, watching the slow rise and fall of her daughter's chest, as if confirming with every breath that the night had not taken another piece from her. Ethan lay propped against white pillows, awake now, his eyes tracking Rachel with careful respect, as though sensing that there was another story moving beneath her silence. For a long time neither of them spoke. The secrets between them filled the room with a tension different from fear. Finally Rachel broke the quiet in a voice so controlled it sounded practiced. She said that the way he had spoken about medicine felt familiar to her, in a way she had not expected. Ethan waited without pressing. Rachel drew a slow breath and told him that before the diner and the classrooms and the endless counting of tips, she had once stood inside laboratories that smelled of disinfectant and possibility. She had been a top student in biomedical engineering, with a focus on neural regenerative systems. She had believed with the stubborn optimism of youth that science could be shaped into rescue. She had met Daniel when they were both still chasing futures that felt too large to fear. He had worked construction while studying safety systems and project management at night. They married quickly, with the careless confidence of people who believed struggle was temporary. When Sophie was born, they had thought the hardest work was behind them. Then the offer came for Daniel to supervise a high-risk retrofit on a corporate medical facility expansion. The pay was generous. The timeline was rushed. The safety margins were thinner than anyone admitted aloud. Daniel had complained about faulty supports the week before the accident and had been told quietly that delays were unacceptable. The day the scaffold failed, Rachel was in class learning about neural pathways and trauma thresholds when her phone vibrated with a number she did not recognize. By the time she reached the site, the silence had already settled over what remained. She told Ethan that she had not cried at first, because there was no space for it. There had only been paperwork and questions, and the sudden knowledge that her life had been moved without her permission. The company representatives had been kind in the polished way that remained distant. They offered a settlement quickly with language that promised stability and warned of uncertainty. When she refused, they shifted to softer threats concealed as advice. She described the phone calls, the casual mentions of Sophie's school, the implication that custody battles were harder for widows without resources. Ethan felt a cold understanding settle in his stomach as the pieces aligned with the machine he knew too well. Rachel said she signed not because she believed them but because she could no longer afford the risk of proving them wrong. She dropped out of her program that semester and never returned. There were bills and childcare and the daily arithmetic of survival that left no margin for ideals. The knowledge she had carried quietly began to rust through disuse. When Ethan collapsed, she had not thought of theory, only muscle memory had answered. Rachel looked at her hands as if seeing them again for the first time. She said she never told anyone about her studies because people either did not believe her or believed it changed what they were allowed to want from her. It felt safer to be invisible on purpose than exceptional by accident. Ethan listened with his heart pressed open by the weight of another truth shaped by power and compromise. He said that the company Daniel had worked under sounded familiar, and that many of the firms in his sector shared contractors through layered subsidiaries. Rachel met his eyes sharply then and asked if he was part of that chain. Ethan answered that he did not know yet, but that he would find out. The room seemed to tilt beneath that possibility. Rachel felt fear surge sharply through her, and forced it down out of habit. Sophie stirred in her sleep and Rachel smoothed her hair, grounding herself in the warmth of the small body she had protected alone for so long. Ethan said that she should never have had to choose between truth and safety, and that he could not undo what had been taken from her, but he would not allow it to be buried again beneath convenience. Rachel felt the instinct to refuse help rise immediately because help had always arrived with conditions. But this felt different in shape even if the risk remained. She told him she had learned to live with what she lost, and he answered that living was not the same as being done. The words lingered between them like a door not yet touched. Outside the window, dawn worked slowly along the edge of the ocean, replacing neon reflection with soft gray light. It felt like a morning that carried more than one ending inside it. In the corridor, the movement of the executive team grew more urgent, and the sound carried faintly into the room. Rachel knew the world that had injured her once was circling again through Ethan. She told him that if what he faced next was dangerous, he should keep her and Sophie far from it. Ethan said quietly that distance had not protected any of them so far. The children slept on innocent to the negotiations of power that waited outside the door. For the first time since Daniel's death, Rachel felt the faint pull of a future that was not built strictly from caution. It frightened her as much as it steadied her. Ethan watched her with the clarity of a man who had begun to understand what had been stolen, not only from him but from the woman now sharing his silence. Two pasts, shaped by loss and agreement, had crossed inside a single night, and neither of them would be able to pretend again that their stories were finished being told. The momentum outside the hospital room shifted from urgency to orchestration, with unnerving speed, and Rachel felt it before the first accusation reached her name. Phones vibrated across the city in synchronized ripples, as narratives hardened into headlines, and by the time the morning news anchors finished the first cycle of speculation, Grant Wilder's version of events had already found its audience. The collapse at the restaurant was reframed as evidence. Selective footage showed Ethan losing balance at the very moment the edited trial video surged online, stitched together to imply guilt and panic rather than stress and sudden physiological failure. Within hours, analysts questioned not only his leadership but the integrity of the entire research division. The board moved into emergency session under the pretense of stabilizing investor confidence, but Grant guided the tempo with the quiet authority of someone who had been preparing this music for a long time. He spoke of duty and public image, of the danger of scandal attached to experimental medicine, and of the growing perception that Ethan's personal instability was now a corporate liability. While Ethan lay under observation, stripped of access to his own systems by medical and procedural necessity, Grant's allies distributed internal memos that blurred concern into strategy. The implication was simple and lethal. Cole Neurotech needed to be protected from its founder. Rachel learned the second half of the trap before she ever learned the first. A uniformed social worker arrived at the hospital with calm questions about Sophie's home environment. Rachel answered with the reflex of long practice, steady and concise. The woman remained courteous but persistent, referencing an anonymous report that alleged Sophie had been placed in a dangerous public confrontation involving a powerful corporate figure. The wording was surgical, not an accusation. A concern. The kind of concern that traveled quickly through systems trained to prioritize caution over context. Rachel felt the old fear rise in her throat sharper now, because it carried the weight of witness. She asked who had made the report and was told the source was confidential. She asked what constituted danger and was told that exposure to volatile public conflict qualified. She understood immediately how the pieces were intended to close around her. Before the social worker left, she reminded Rachel that temporary custody reviews were best resolved swiftly for the good of the child. The phrase echoed with institutional chill. Rachel held Sophie closer as the woman walked away. When Rachel told Ethan what had occurred, he felt the shape of the trap with frightening clarity. Grant was not only dismantling his authority but isolating Rachel through the most effective pressure point she possessed. A mother's fear could accomplish what any legal argument stalled on. By afternoon, a second wave of attack landed with calculated precision. Rachel's photograph began circulating online under speculative headlines that spoke of a single mother entangled with a disgraced billionaire. Anonymous sources claimed she had positioned herself strategically at the restaurant, and that her sudden role in Ethan's medical crisis suggested premeditation rather than coincidence. Old images from her social media accounts were repurposed with captions that implied opportunism. Her past education was reframed as evidence of ulterior design rather than interrupted ambition. The narrative shifted her from victim to infiltrator in the space of a few hours. By evening, the accusation hardened into something more dangerous. An unnamed source alleged that Rachel had accessed restricted laboratory materials in the past, and that her relationship with Ethan created a security breach. The claim was absurd yet effective. It planted doubt inside the only ground that mattered, the board. Rachel watched the transformation of her life into a cautionary spectacle through hospital television screens she could not turn off without also losing distraction for the children. Sophie sensed the change without understanding it, and asked why strangers were suddenly using her mommy's picture. Rachel answered with a lie shaped gently enough to sound like comfort. That night, a restraining notice was issued limiting Rachel's access to Ethan's corporate facilities pending investigation. The legal language was neutral and devastating. She was no longer allowed near the apparatus that was now actively defining her reputation. Meanwhile, Ethan was summoned to appear before the emergency board, hearing the following morning medical clearance or not. Grant framed the urgency as protection. Public faith required decisive leadership. The fact that Ethan's collapse and the allegations against Rachel converged so neatly was presented as unfortunate coincidence. Ethan recognized it instantly as engineering. In the quiet of the hospital room that evening, the walls no longer felt protective. Rachel sat beside Sophie as her daughter slept fitfully, the shape of nightmares pulling her small body into uneasy stillness. Rachel knew the terrain she had been forced onto. It was the same terrain she had crossed after Daniel's death, where truth was negotiable and safety was conditional. She told Ethan that if the board believed she had endangered Sophie, they would not wait for resolution to act. Ethan said that if Grant succeeded in framing her as a liability, the custody review would accelerate in weeks rather than months. The trap had been set to close in two directions at once: remove Ethan's control over his company and Rachel's control over her daughter. The pressure on both would fracture any united defense. Rachel asked quietly if he thought the board would listen to reason. Ethan answered with equal quiet that the board would listen to confidence. Grant had built a version of both that excluded them. As the night deepened, a legal representative delivered documents that outlined the scope of the investigation into Rachel's background. Every line felt invasive and relentless. Rachel signed nothing. She had learned the cost of signing under pressure. Outside the room, Grant met with investors in private corridors and presented himself as the steady alternative to a shaken institution. He spoke of transition not as betrayal but as necessary evolution. The pieces moved precisely as he intended. By midnight, the media consensus had turned. Ethan was no longer the visionary founder under stress. He was the risk factor. Rachel was no longer a single mother caught in a moment of coincidence. She was a possible infiltrator. Oliver sensed the shift in his father without understanding its mechanics and asked whether they were in trouble. Ethan told him the truth in the only way he could. He said that some people were afraid and made choices that hurt others when fear guided them. Oliver asked if fear could take Sophie away. The question struck Rachel with force, and she had no immediate answer. Before sleep claimed the room in fragments, Rachel made one decision with sudden clarity. Grant's strategy depended on silence and isolation. She would give him neither. If the board wanted testimony built on accusation, she would bring testimony built on truth. And if the world insisted on turning her into a threat, she would stand where she could be seen clearly at last. The boardroom of Cole Neurotech had always been designed to inspire awe rather than comfort, a cathedral of glass and steel, suspended above the city where power moved in quiet gestures and measured pauses. That morning it was filled before Ethan arrived, every seat occupied by men and women whose loyalty was balanced between profit and fear. Screens along the walls flashed muted headlines, his face framed by words like scandal and instability, while analysts debated his future in clipped tones. Grant Wilder stood near the head of the table, speaking in low, confident assurances, painting the image of a company that needed firm hands and unshaken nerves. When Ethan entered, still pale from the night before, a ripple moved through the room that no amount of corporate discipline could fully suppress. He walked without assistance, though his body had not yet released the tremor of exhaustion. At his side walked Rachel, her posture straight, despite the knowledge that every eye now carried a judgment she had not chosen. The sight of her entering that room was the first disruption Grant had not anticipated with precision. A murmur rose, surprise, sharpening into visible tension as Grant's practiced calm faltered for half a second before returning. Ethan took his seat without ceremony and placed his hands flat against the table as if grounding himself in the reality of the moment. The chair reserved for Rachel remained conspicuously empty for one breath too long. Then Ethan pulled it back with his own hand and invited her to sit beside him. The gesture landed with quiet force. The meeting was called to order with clipped formality. Grant presented first, his voice steady as he outlined the sequence of events that had led to the crisis. He spoke of public trust, of accountability, of the dangers inherent in visionary science when governance wavered. He touched lightly on Ethan's collapse, referring to it as an unfortunate but illuminating incident. Then he turned the focus with deliberate ease toward Rachel. He referred to security concerns, to unverified access, to the optics of personal entanglement with corporate leadership. His words were careful enough to sound neutral, yet each phrase guided the room toward a single conclusion. Rachel listened without interruption, her hands folded in her lap, her expression unreadable. When Grant finished, silence held for a suspended moment before the room shifted its attention toward Ethan. The chair of the board asked him if he had a response. Ethan answered, not with defense but with admission. He said that fear had guided some of his recent decisions, and that grief had shaped more of his life than he cared to acknowledge. He said that building Cole Neurotech had once been an act of hope, but that somewhere in its expansion, he had mistaken distance for strength. He took responsibility for choosing momentum over presence, and admitted that the consequences of that choice had reached further than he had been willing to see. The room absorbed his words with cautious calculation. Then Ethan turned and asked Rachel if she would speak. Grant's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Rachel rose, aware of the magnitude of what she was about to risk, and began with a clarity that did not ask permission. She told them who she was before the labels they had assigned her. She spoke of her education, of the work she had once hoped to do, and of the accident that had ended her husband's life, under a contract that belonged to the greater spell of corporate urgency many of them now served. She described the settlement she had signed under quiet pressure, and the choice she had been forced to make between safety and justice. She told them about the evening at the restaurant without embellishment, about being asked to move, about the collapse, about acting on instinct rather than design. Then she addressed the allegations directly. She said she had never breached security, never accessed restricted systems, and never pursued proximity to Ethan for advantage. She said the only motive she had carried into that restaurant had been to feed her child after a shift that had already lasted too long. Silence followed, in a different shape than before. Some members of the board avoided her gaze. Others watched her with narrowed attention as the distance between rumor and witness began to stretch uncomfortably thin. Ethan then delivered the final piece Grant had counted on burying beneath distraction. He produced internal communications, traced through subsidiary channels, linking the edited video release to intermediaries hired through third-party public relations firms, controlled quietly by Grant's own investment group. The chain was clean enough to hide in plain sight, yet precise enough to unravel under scrutiny. He showed timestamps that aligned with the moment Grant had positioned himself near the bar at the restaurant. The room shifted again as the projection screens filled with data Grant had not believed would surface so soon. Grant objected at once, calling the evidence circumstantial, accusing Ethan of manufacturing a narrative to deflect from his collapse. Rachel then spoke one final time. She said that the social worker visit to her home had not been motivated by concern for Sophie but by coordination. She produced the call logs and the timing of the report that Grant's office had withdrawn shortly after midnight under the guise of procedural correction. The weight of the pattern became impossible to ignore. The chair of the board ordered a recess. In the private corridor outside, voices rose and fell with contained urgency as alliances shifted under pressure. When the board reconvened, decision moved with accelerated certainty. Grant was placed on immediate administrative leave pending formal investigation into manipulation of media channels and internal governance interference. His expression hardened into something close to fury before discipline reclaimed his features. Ethan was reinstated with conditional authority under expanded oversight. The room turned once more toward Rachel. The allegations against her were formally suspended for lack of credible substantiation. The decision did not feel like victory. It felt like a narrow corridor open through hostile terrain. When the meeting adjourned, Ethan remained seated for a moment longer than required, as if measuring the truth of what had just occurred. Rachel stood beside him with a quiet steadiness that drew no celebration to itself. Outside the boardroom, Oliver waited with Sophie under the care of a legal aide who had volunteered without instruction. When Ethan emerged and knelt to embrace his son, the child clung to him with an intensity that left no room for performance. Rachel watched the reunion with a softness she did not attempt to hide. In the echoing corridor of power where decisions fractured lives at distance, love had entered without agenda and rewritten the shape of consequence in its wake. The months that followed the boardroom reckoning unfolded with a quiet that felt unfamiliar to all of them, not because the world had stopped moving but because the noise around their lives had changed its tone. coal neurotech continued to dominate headlines, yet the stories shifted from scandal to cautious reform as oversight tightened and new leadership practices took root. Ethan quietly transferred 50% of his controlling power into a public trust that governed the company with shared authority rather than singular command, a decision that stunned investors and unsettled rivals who had thrived on leverage and secrecy. He did not frame the change as sacrifice, but as alignment with the person he had forgotten how to be. Oliver returned to school without the weekly appointments that had once defined his calendar, not because the memory of loss had faded, but because he no longer carried it alone. The nightmares grew fewer, the silences softened. He spoke of his mother without whispering, and sometimes even laughed when he remembered her stubborn kindness. Rachel no longer ran 3 jobs through each stretch of daylight. She resumed her studies part-time in a program that recognized both what she had earned and what had been stolen from her without consent. The work was slow and demanding, but for the first time since Daniel's death it belonged to her future rather than her survival. Sophie thrived between 2 households that no longer felt divided by fear. She still sang in the shower for her mother, but now it was because joy had returned to the place that pain had once occupied. On quiet evenings, they shared simple dinners that carried none of the ceremony of fine dining, yet all of the meaning that had been missing from their earlier lives. The ocean remained a steady presence beyond the windows of Ethan's coastal home, where Rachel and the children visited on weekends without pretense. Oliver built elaborate cities of driftwood and stone along the shore, with Sophie as his tireless co-architect, their laughter rising and falling with the tide. Ethan watched them with the grounding knowledge that presence did not require perfection. It required only return. Rachel moved through the space with cautious familiarity at first, and then with growing ease as the house learned to speak in the language of shared routines rather than guarded hospitality. One afternoon, as they walked together beneath a sky washed clean with salt light, Sophie climbed halfway up the stairs of a lifeguard tower and called out with sudden certainty that Ethan was her almost dad. The phrase landed with innocent authority, and laughter followed it like release. Ethan met Rachel's eyes in that moment, and neither looked away. There was no declaration of forever in their exchange, only acceptance of what had quietly become true. Love had not arrived with fireworks or reckless momentum. It had unfolded in patient gestures and shared burdens, and the courage to choose one another again when retreat would have been easier. On the anniversary of Daniel's death, they planted a tree in a public garden, where children played without knowledge of what had been lost there. Rachel spoke his name without trembling, and Sophie introduced him to Oliver, as if describing a star he would one day recognize in the night sky. Ethan stood beside them, without discomfort, honoring a past that was not his to replace, but his to respect. The investigation into Grant's actions moved through formal channels with steady consequence. He was removed from the company he had tried to remold through manipulation, his reputation diminished, not by scandal but by the quiet record of evidence that erased his advantage without spectacle. Justice arrived without apology and without satisfaction. Ethan learned to accept that some victories did not require celebration. On an evening that carried no calendar meaning, the 4 of them returned to the same stretch of beachfront where the first unguarded night had drawn their lives together. The restaurant still stood where glass met water, but they passed it without pause, and chose instead a small place farther down the shore, where the food arrived on simple plates, and the lights did not pretend to be chandeliers. They sat at a table by the open doorway where the sound of waves replaced the hum of judgment. Oliver reached for Ethan's hand without hesitation. Sophie leaned against Rachel's shoulder and hummed with quiet contentment. The world beyond that narrow frame continued as it always had, driven by urgency and appetite and ambition. Yet within the circle they had built nothing needed to be proven. Ethan watched the children and felt a soft ache that no longer hurt. It reminded him of the life he had nearly lost to distance, and the one he now carried with deliberate care. Rachel lifted her glass and said that she had learned something important from the hardest season of her life. She said that love did not ask to be earned through endurance. It only asked to be chosen through fear. Ethan answered that he had learned that success was not the absence of loss, but the presence of those who stayed when loss called. Sophie announced that if they were all together then everything was already good. Oliver agreed with solemn finality. As the evening drew into its quiet close, and the last light settled into the water, Ethan understood with clarity he had never held before that some things only became possible when one was willing to risk everything that defined him. For the first time in his life, he did not measure what he had gained against what he might lose. He only felt the steady truth of the moment. And in that moment Ethan Cole understood that there were things which, if he had not dared to release, he would never have truly owned at all. If this story touched something quiet inside you, if you felt even one moment where loneliness softened into hope, then you were never just watching a story, you were walking through a reflection of real human longing. Stories like this are not only about billionaires or single parents or dramatic twists, they are about the invisible battles people fight every day while still choosing to stay kind. Somewhere right now, a child is hoping their parent comes home early just to say goodnight. Somewhere, a parent is wondering if the sacrifices they make will ever truly be seen. And somewhere, two people who have been hurt in very different ways are standing one decision away from choosing love over fear. If you believe those moments matter, then your presence here matters too. Your like is not just a click, it is a signal that compassion still has a place in a world that often moves too fast to notice it. Your comment is not just a word, it is a voice joining a growing community of people who still believe in healing, in second chances, and in families that are chosen through courage rather than blood alone. If you have ever felt invisible, if you have ever been misunderstood, if you have ever carried grief in silence, then this story was also written for you. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that broken beginnings do not decide final endings. And if you want to keep walking through stories where ordinary souls meet extraordinary moments, where kindness ripples outward and changes more than just one life, then stay with us. Subscribe not just for the next episode but for the reminder that empathy still has power. Tell us where you are watching from, whether it is a quiet city apartment, a small town porch, a long night shift, or a place where dreams feel distant but not forgotten. Every voice adds breath to this space. And before you go, ask yourself one simple question tonight. If you had the chance to choose love, even when it risked everything you thought defined you, would you take it? If your answer is even a quiet yes, then you already understand the heart of this story. We will be here for the next one when you are ready to feel again.